This is the Sports Tech Playbook, a podcast series on sports technology hosted by Daoud of Compliance Standards and Julien Blin of Upside Global. Thank you for listening.
My name is Daoud from Compliance Standards, and a while back, not too long ago, I would say a couple of months ago, we had an episode with Julien Blin, a great analyst on sports technology. I was pretty much interested in a topic that, as I said before, I have zero knowledge, and so I spoke to him, and we decided to get back to it, potentially turning that into an every 2 weeks event, and of course, if we see any interest, we could even expand that. So thank you for joining me again, Julien. Good morning. This time, what I wanted to do is I wanted you essentially to delve into sort of the trade tensions that we've witnessed over the past few months and their impact on the sports technology industry. As you know, the recent tariff implementations may have affected or imports from key manufacturing hubs like China and Vietnam. There could be ripple effects. We're hearing some different rumblings. Companies are, saying different things. In the business which I cover, one of the businesses that I cover is the recycling industry. There seems to be no impact yet. And so, it would be interesting to see what's your take on this. So, from your perspective, how have recent tariffs implementations specifically affected the sports technology industry, if any?
Well, I think, the other day I saw an ad from a performance tech vendor. They have a hardware device. What was interesting, what I saw on the ad was because of the tariff, it says because of the tariffs, we're going to have to increase the price. And that was one of the first products that I saw that actually mentioned clearly because of tariff, it's going to impact the pricing. And so I think it's going to be slowly going to see more and more vendors, doing stuff like this, right? Telling the customers, look, we're sorry, but basically what's happening is Trump is increasing the tariffs, on China and other countries. And as you said, many of the performance tech products that are hardware products are being made in, cities like Shenzhen, right? Where many of the product come from. And because they're increasing tariffs, the cost is increasing, the margins are going to shrink. And so one of the easiest way for the vendors to offset that, the decrease in margin is to pass the cost on to the customers. And that's why you're starting to see, I think, those vendors to announce a price increase, right? So, I expect to see more and more, but it hasn't been something that I've seen a big way. I mean, most of the vendors, I think they're still, waiting to see what's going to happen. But there definitely some vendors that I've seen are starting to do this, right?
And do did you get feedback from the teams? I know just before we started recording this, you mentioned that players get millions of dollars, but the head of IT departments are have to justify why they need often a small budget, but are they reporting back to you, telling you that things are going up price wise, or they're not in a panic mode yet?
No, I haven't seen teams say that, stuff like that. However, what I've seen is, especially in the NCAA with the NIL, I have seen the NIL impacting the budget, the tech budget of those teams. And I can explain how it's happening. But basically, I was recently talking to a vendor that had a machine that cost like $35,000, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so typically in college sports, what they do is they find private donors to pay for those machines, right? Like $30K. In that case, what happened is that they had a private donor who was willing to pay $35K. But what happened is basically the coaching staff of that basketball team say, look, we're going to take that $35K to use it to make an offer to a player for $1.5 million, right? So basically, I think some teams are trying to interfere and get those sports tech budgets, that money, to make offers to student athletes, right? To make big offers to them. And that's partially due to the NIL. There's I mean, the trades are getting in the millions. Like I was at a college conference, and there were some team I talked to said we had to pay some quarterback like $4 million. These are young student athletes, right, that are asking $4 million just for them. Why? Because some of them, he said, they know how much those programs are making, and therefore they actually get a chunk of it, right? So I think that you see an impact from the NIL on the budget, the tech budget of those teams. But as far as the teams saying, look, we're getting impacted by the tariffs, I haven't seen that yet.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so I would imagine that there's probably some measures that companies are taking to diversify maybe their supply chain in response to these tariffs. It's sort of anytime you talk about tariffs, the first thing that comes to mind is cost of the products at the origination and the supply chain strategies. Are you seeing any companies sort of looking to diversify? There's this nearshoring, this is manufacturing in the US, or is it too early for them, or maybe it's not? Maybe it's underway.
I think it's just too early. I mean, we talked about these the last time. Many of the performance tech product, the hardware products, are made in like country like China, where the labor cost is a lot lower. I think some vendors are probably looking at other countries like Mexico, for example, or I've heard companies, making their product in like Costa Rica in South America. So I think you have to look at, the cost, right? What is the cost of labor in those countries? And you have to do the math, right? If you relocate, your factory to other countries where the cost of labor might be higher, you really have to be careful about that, right? Because in the long run, maybe making a product in Shenzhen is still the cheapest way, right? So I think you really have to do math. But I think the vendors are starting to explore and investigate, but I haven't seen vendors to make drastic change and say, look, we're going to relocate our factory to another country because of the tariffs. I haven't seen that yet.
So from your perspective, domestic manufacturing is not necessarily on anyone's radar screen right now, right? Do you see any potential benefits for companies to manufacture in their home countries, US, Canada, Western Europe, or are there more drawbacks?
I think there are some benefits. For example, the one biggest main complaint I've heard about making a product in China is the quality of the product. The QA, sometimes I've heard many vendors say, look, what we are expecting, what we asked for them to build, they got the color wrong, they got the specs wrong. So I think sometimes the quality, the QA from country like China is not the best. So that's why I think some vendors, also proximity, right? They want to get closer to the factories. I know, for example, one company where in the US, it's easier for them to go to Costa Rica, right, to talk to the factory rather than flying all the way back to China, right? So I think that there's other, I guess, reason why they like to relocate, their factories either in the US or South America, but again, not for the tariffs just yet, but just for other benefits like the QA or proximity.
Yeah, absolutely. Does any of this affect innovation and R&D? I mean, are you seeing among those startups, sort of hesitation, or are they still, continuing onto their innovation path?
When you say R&D, you mean like the where the engineering team is based? Is that what you're talking about?
Oh, just not just the location, but generally their plans. I mean, because obviously the supply chain is could be disrupted because sort of the areas where a lot of the work takes place, namely China and other places and Taiwan, etc., are disrupted. Does that sort of change the minds of those companies that are in the business, saying, okay, we're going to slow it down for a little while until things get better?
I think, a lot of the companies that I work with, usually their R&D team are not based in China or Asia or those countries. They're usually based in their headquarters, where they can control the R&D and, they can design a product, they can get closer to the product itself. There are, of course, some exceptions. I've seen some companies who have, for example, their R&D team in Vietnam or other countries. But for the most part, When it comes to product management engineering team, they tend to be where their headquarters is based, whether it's in the US, Europe, or whatever it may be. So I don't think it's got an impact on the tariffs have any impact on that, on the R&D side.
Okay, but you look at it in the long term. In your opinion, what would you tell these companies to do to mitigate the risks tied to this ongoing dispute, and what are a future trade dispute? What is sort of the maybe some of the takeaways that you would tell them to think about for the future?
I think what I would tell them is you have to look to diversify supply chain in case you really see an impact from the tariffs, right? There's alternative, other countries. For example, I mentioned Mexico, India, Vietnam. There's some other locations where that could be a good option other than maybe China. You also have to look at, you could strengthen partnerships with strategic companies, maybe look at in other countries. I mean, we talked about the R&D, but to me, the R&D is really, you cannot compromise quality, right? Yeah, because you have to keep the quality high, and having, your product and the R&D department in countries where the level of expertise is not as high. That thing, to me, you don't want to have this. You need to get it right? So you cannot compromise, in my opinion, on R&D. I think that's the one thing you don't want to compromise. I think there's other maybe benefits or other things to do, things like leveraging the trade incentives and tax credits. There might be some other government where they give you incentives, right, to relocate in their countries. Also, one thing that I've seen is some hardware companies switch to a model instead of capex, what they call leasing, meaning that you literally it's a leasing program, right? You can pay annually or monthly for both. It's for hardware product, but you pay a subscription. And I think there's some benefits of having and selling your product under a subscription leasing program, especially if you're doing hardware and software. And I've seen some companies, for example, not from the US, but outside the US, that have a hardware product with a software component, but they were leasing the product annually or monthly, and they can get away with some of those tariffs and the impacts of the tariffs. So these are just some tricks that I've seen companies do. Instead of saying, no, we're not 100% a hardware company, because we have a software component, we can get away with some of the impact of tariffs.
Yeah, and by the way, I mean, this always been, leasing has always been sort of a desired strategy for many OEMs, regardless of what kind of product they sell, right? Because what you do is you lock in your customer forever, right? And if you do a good job in terms of supporting them, in terms of customer service, it's a recurring income. In fact, perhaps the perfect model of this, one of the perfect models of this is Microsoft 360, right? And that's a product that you have to buy every year, and the price points are pretty fantastic. I mean, I have one for I have several licenses with them, but one of them is for my home use, and it's like $69, $70. It doesn't break the bank. It's cost effective, and yet it's for Microsoft, it's a projectable, predictable model where they know exactly more or less where their revenue streams are going to come next year, for instance. So I'm totally not surprised. But what you said, though, would certainly require some kind of policy engagement. And let me see if I can explain what I mean by that. So typically, every big industry has lobby groups, right? That would engage, that would try to influence, trade policies that affect their business, right? You have the oil industry, the petroleum industry, you have the technology industry. Do you see, is the sports tech industry big enough to have, first, do they have an industry stakeholder group? And if they do, and if they don't, are they big enough to actually, get that to influence policy in ways that would protect their own interest?
I think, well, I mean, when you're talking about the sports tech industry, you're looking at I think 4 to 5 thousand startup, which is tiny, right, compared to other industries. So I'm sure there are some groups out there to do just what you described, but I think the industry is still fairly small, and I don't think they've got a big impact as much as some other industry like consumer electronics, the Apple, Samsung of the world. I think it's still a fairly small group. So I don't think they have, like I said, that much impact on the policies. However, I think they are, it's in their best interest, right, to really work with, the agency, the government, right, who provide financial incentives for domestic manufacturing, R&D, export support, right? So I think you're going to see more sports tech startups to engage, right, with economic development agencies, to access to those resources because it's there. And if in the long run it's going to impact their product, right, they might as well start talking to those agencies to see how they can make it work, and also I've seen companies do that, right, in sports and tech. They put it on their website. They would put like "Made in America," literally product made in America, which, as with the current administration, they like that, right? So, so there are some companies, right, who make their product in the U.S., but they don't make products in very large scale, right? Like an Apple or Samsung, right? It's in the thousands of units. So in their case, it's okay. They can manage the cost, right? The labor costs, especially. But yeah, I think it's, if I were the CEO of a sports tech company, I would start literally researching and start talking to the agencies to see how I could make it work potentially long term.
When I buy devices and small technology equipment and even bigger technology equipment, most of them, when I buy them from Amazon or any other Best Buy, most of them, if not all of them, come from China, right? So that's the topic that we've been talking about. But here's what's interesting: a lot of them are Chinese-made products and branded Chinese products. A lot, I've been using a QR code, printer. I've been using a blood pressure monitor. I've been using a blood glucose monitor. Everything is not only made in China, but it's branded Chinese companies. How do you see this affecting the sports tech market in the US with products coming out of China, but also branded as Chinese companies or Chinese brands? Does that mean that the US market is shrinking in terms of supply? Or does that mean that the American companies that are in the US have better opening now because their Chinese competitors are decreasing? In other words, what's the impact of Chinese branded products in the sports tech business in the US and Europe?
So first of all, in the world of elite sports, right, practitioners who buy those products, they're very attached to brands that they trust. I have not come across, some leading, Chinese vendors in the space. They come from like Europe, from Italy, from Spain, from South America, from the US. But so I don't think it's going to impact much, because again, the practitioners are very attached to the current vendor that they use and that they trust. Trust is everything in this industry, right? So even if there might be a cheaper vendor from China, the other issue is, as you know, right? I mean, anything that comes from China, right? There's also this fear, okay, the Chinese government, right? Using and having access to the data, which for some people might not fly with them, right? So, but yeah, I don't think it's going to impact much the current Chinese vendors in sports and tech because to my knowledge, there's not a ton of them. For example, we have a database of about 450 performance tech product, and I can't even think of, even like 5 Chinese vendors in the database. And these are the main vendors that all the team use for the most part. So I think it's just a fraction because having a product that from China might be cheaper, it's not the only thing they care about, right? They care about the validity. They care about have they done studies, which teams have been using them. Like sometimes I come across some vendors who say, look, we have customers in China, team is using them. And I'm thinking that's great. But you know what? In the eyes of, if I'm the 49ers or if I'm the Dolphins, it's not enough. Like, who are your customers in the US, right? And if the answer is no, I don't have any, then you know what? It's not going to be enough to convince me to buy the product, even if it's cheaper.
Yeah, so I think you shared a pretty interesting number. You said like not even five out of the 500. That's a tiny portion. Does that mean that, is it possible that because the scale, well, we have a couple of things really. One is the size and the scale of that market makes it a very niche market. And because it's a niche market, there is no, it's not scalable for companies from China that are used to mass market, right? And so is that, to your knowledge, an important factor? In other words, they cannot sell millions of those devices at a low cost. Therefore, that's not a market of interest to them, at least at the moment.
It might be, but keep in mind the biggest performance tech company that I know, they have the biggest one. They have 3, 4, 5,000 customers as teams, and that's by far the biggest customers, the biggest vendors out there, right? Most of the sports tech vendors, they probably have, if I had to guess, like 50 to 100 customers, meaning the teams. So to your point, yeah, it may be too small of a market for Chinese companies to get into it. Um, there's probably a reason, but like you said earlier, the sports tech industry is a niche market to begin with. It's not a mass market, even though there are products like Ura, right, that you and I can buy, a Whoop, that this sells in much bigger volume. But for the most part, it's a niche market, right, for practitioners who buy and need those products to reduce injuries, to improve the load management, the sleep, whatever they need, right? So yeah, I think it's probably this market is too small for Chinese vendors to really spend a lot of time when they can just go after the mass market.
Yeah. So then the issue is clearly, sourcing components to assemble a product
Yeah.
to make for the market. And so therefore the problem that the sports tech industry might or might not have is essentially where those products are, where are the components being produced. And in this case, I think if I understand, they're produced in China, and that's where the issue is. And potentially what you're not proposing, but what you're suggesting is to do nearshoring or producing them in country, and that's gonna inevitably increase the cost.
Yeah, I mean, look, like you said, the majority of the components are made in China, right? China, Taiwan. That's always been like that. It's not just for sports and tech. I mean, it's
Yeah,
consumer,
everything,
same
everything.
thing. Um, but yeah, I think it's going to stay that way. But again, until we see an impact on the price of those components, which you might see in 1, 2, or 3 years, then they might see some vendors to kind of readjusting, maybe relocating the factories. But again, if the labor cost is much higher in Mexico or Costa, or other countries, then you really have to be careful about relocating your whole factory, because it's a trade-off, right? What is the increase of the tariff versus the cost of labor in other countries? And if you realize, what, it's not going to make a big difference, then you're better off staying in China, right? So I
Yeah,
think you have to
absolutely.
look at the pros and cons.
And so final thought, glass half empty, glass half full.
For the impact of tariffs,
Uh-huh.
I think the jury is still up in the air. We haven't really seen, lots and lots of vendors readjusting, increasing pricing. I've seen one company, to be honest with you, just one that I came across on Facebook. So that tells me that we're still very, very early. And you saw Trump, right, pausing the tariffs, for 90 days. I know there's a deadline, I think June 2nd, with the European countries that he talked about recently. But I think it's just too early. We have to wait and see. I hope it's not going to impact the price of those products in a big way, but it's hard to tell right now.
Just for my own gratification now, when you look at the base of companies that you cover,
Hmm.
and by collectively I mean both the producers of devices and folks that invest in them, what's the distribution by region? And I'm assuming most of them would be spread between US and Western Europe.
Yes, I think there's Europe, and there's a lot of great products from Europe, from the US. Canada is another one. There's also a lot of interesting products coming out of Asia, especially Australia. But yeah, it's mostly those countries. I mean, those regions, not countries. But like I said, there's always exception. There's great product coming out of Japan or
Of course, yeah.
Korea. I mean, South America. But yeah, the majority of what you see is coming from Europe, or I should say Western Europe, and then North America.
And is there a dominant country in this world? I know that typically you would think the US, because of the way sort of the venture capital world is structured, it's much broader. There's a lot more money. Typically, the US is where you see a lot more innovation, particularly tied to Silicon Valley and
Yeah,
technology. Is that a fair assessment?
I would say yes. I mean, there's the most established, product in sports and tech coming from the US. There's also lots of innovation happening in Europe, for example, countries like England, like Israel, for example. But yeah, I think if you look at the numbers, it's probably coming from the US as a
Yeah.
percentage. Yeah.
And I do see, from the work that you do, a lot of things tied to France. I know part of it is because
Yeah.
you're a Frenchman yourself, but France is probably a place where you see quite a bit of innovation coming from.
There is innovation, but I think what I'm seeing, and I work with lots of vendors and teams in France, right? The one thing I've heard the teams complain about, like soccer team, right, Ligue 1, is that I remember talking to a team in Liga, and they said, look, every time we put an RFP out there, it's always the same vendors, the French company will reply to it. And they almost got frustrated to the fact that it's only the same companies who always apply, and they wish there would be more innovation. Companies from other countries would apply. So, yes, there are some companies innovating in France, but I don't think it's the most innovative country in Europe. Like you said, you see a lot of great innovation from England. I mean, from the Netherlands, from Germany, even from Spain. But I don't think today you could say, hey, France is dominant player in sports and tech in Europe. I don't think that's the case.
Right. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
And I'm
Well, I
saying
think
that because I'm French, but I honestly don't
right,
think
right.
that they are. I mean, look at Israel. There's a lot of great Israeli companies we've done, got great traction in the US, but it's a small country too, right? 8 million people versus 70 million plus in France. But and sometimes you see small countries creating a lot of innovative companies in sports and tech, right? It doesn't go with size necessarily.
Well, I mean, in the case of Israel, I mean, they have obviously a very, very positive sort of trade relations with the U.S., even though
Yeah.
they also have the tariffs, but generally they have preferential status. And, and so they have access to what the same companies in the U.S. have access to in the same way, with the same legislation, with the same rules. But they have, to your point, they have excellent technology base and technologists and innovators that feed into Israel's equivalent to Silicon Valley, if you will. So
Yeah.
I'm not surprised. Profitability. I mean, share with me. I know it's a little bit out of the scope of this discussion today, but it would be something really interesting to talk about. Are these companies, or are some of them, the winners? And I know we're going to be talking at some point the fact that there are 4,000 or 5,000 companies out there. It's a little crowded, and most of them are probably not that great. But for the ones that are successful, I don't know, half a dozen. You tell me, what's sort of the revenue and profitability profile? Are they happy? Do they make enough money to pay their technologists and scientists and their staff? Are they generating profits that make them feel optimistic to go for the next round of innovation?
It really depends. I mean, there are some companies who makes, $10 million in revenue annually. Some of them make over $100 million, right? Some of
Sure.
them are just break even. They have $1 million in revenue, $1 million in overhead cost. So it really depends. I think the one that have the ability to scale are the ones that have a good process as far as R&D, right? They've got very strong team of engineers and product managers, and obviously salespeople, because sales is essential, right? If you have a great product but you cannot sell it, then so what, right? I also think that having a great customer service team is also a big part of it, because you're dealing with teams, and if you don't treat them properly, right, they're not going to renew, or they're not going to stick with you. Um, but I also think that it's easier for a software company that's an AMS platform, right? Software companies to be profitable faster than hardware companies where there's a capex component, right? People say it's hardware companies, it's way more capital intensive because you've got the cost to produce, right? So I think the one that I've seen with probably the most profitable ones are the software companies, because again, um, it's just easier to get higher margins, right? Versus having a hardware company when the margins are smaller, right?
Right, right. And the profile of a company. In other words, are there any really large recognizable names that are in that space? I would think Samsung, I would think maybe Siemens, I would think maybe IBM. Any of these large name companies are involved in that space?
Yeah, I mean, of course, like Samsung, they many years ago they launched like the wearable products, right? They had a smart ring, for example, that they were offering to teams. The most successful and recognizable sports tech companies are not necessarily of course, there's Apple, right? The Apple Watch, very successful. Lots of teams are using it. But I would say there are some less well-known companies, like, for example, Teamworks, right? Teamworks, it's a software company. They have an AMS platform, right? They can track all the data from GPS, cardio. They've got a nutritional platform that the team use. They have, also software for the operational team to manage calendars, scheduling. And those guys I think they have, I want to say 2, 3, 4,000 customers, meaning the teams, right? So these are very successful companies. Another one is Catapult. It's probably one of the biggest GPS companies. So GPS is, you've seen those athletes wearing those jackets, right? Those small jacket that they use. There's a GPS chip product in the back
That
that tracks
tracks.
the distance run, what we call the load, right? How much they run during a soccer game, right? And Catapult, I think they've got over 1,000 customers, meaning the teams, right? So
Well,
you're not going to see, of course, you got Strava, right? Strava, they've got millions of customers, I think. But the biggest software companies that I've seen in performance tech usually have customers in the 2 or 3, 4,000 type range. They've been there for a long time, but you're not going to see those companies having millions, right, of customers.
yeah.
Direct to consumers like Strava, for example.
And so the smaller ones, let's say you have 4,000 companies out there, you have a handful that are really big, sustainable business, great business model. So the vast majority of them are sort of in your typical startup mode, regardless of an industry. They want to grow, but they face limitations, and therefore part of their strategy is to be able to find somebody to buy their technology, to license their technology, or to buy them all together.
Yeah, so there's a lot of companies who have, let's say, 25, 50 to 100 customers, the teams. And they would, some of those guys usually make, I would say, maybe like close to $1 million in revenue. But their end goal is not, they start in sports, right, to get the recognition. But their ultimate goal sometimes is to go after other verticals: construction, healthcare, government, industrial. Because and I went through this with one of the companies I work for. We had like a product to measure heat stress, hydration, right? And then they studied in sports, right? They had some customers in sports. But then all of a sudden, and I told the CEO, I said, you should really look into construction, industrial. And they literally pivoted to focus on oil and gas, construction companies, because in those verticals, you could make a deal with one oil and gas company like a Chevron that have thousands of field workers, right? So these are much bigger deals as opposed to signing an NFL team with 90 players or signing a soccer team with 20 players, right? So the ultimate goal for many of those companies, and that's what the investors wants too, is to start in sport. But really, if you want to scale the business, you
You
have to go
gotta.
to other verticals like healthcare, government, industrial, because that's where the money is. And that, as an investor, that's where you can get the biggest return on investment.
Absolutely, absolutely. And for listeners, if you want to know more, all you need to do is to go to upsideglobal.co, and you'll have a lot of information there. And don't hesitate to register. Don't hesitate to become a client of Julien's for sure. Julien, with that, thank you so much. This has been very useful, and hopefully, as I said, we'll continue this dialogue to learn more about this sector on an every 2 week rhythm, if you will. And of course, if there is demand for these kinds of discussion, we will certainly consider a more frequent discussions. Thank you very much, Julien.
Thank you, David. Thank you for having me.